The wind howled across the frontier like a living thing, shrieking against the timbers of the half-collapsed barn. Snow drifted knee-deep, swallowing the fence posts one by one, and the world was nothing but white, and silence broken only by the groan of ice. Mary tightened the shawl around her shoulders and pressed her little brother Samuel's hand. At 12, she was already tall for her age, her face sharp from hunger and winter's bite. Beside her, Samuel trembled in his patched coat, too thin for the blizzard. Then came the sound, not the storm, not the cracking timbers, but a muffled thud. Mary froze. Through the swirling white, a dark shape lay crumpled in the snow. For a heartbeat, she thought it was a tree limb, fallen and useless. Then Samuel whispered, voice shaking with both fear and wonder, "Mary, it's a man." The storm seemed ready to swallow him whole. A tall figure sprawled, face down, snow already crusting over his coat. His horse stood a few paces away, reins dragging, sides steaming from the brutal ride. The animal whickered once, stamping nervously, then lowered its head as if mourning. Mama's voice rang in Mary's head. "Don't go out in storms. Nothing but death comes from the snow." But the man wasn't moving. "Help me," Mary said, her voice breaking through the wind. Together the children grabbed his arm, tugging, stumbling as the storm pushed against them. His weight was staggering, like hauling a felled tree. Still they pulled, step by step, dragging him toward the barn's splintered doors. Inside, the cold was no kinder, but at least the wind was muffled. They lowered him onto the dirt floor, his breath shallow, ice stiffening his mustache. Mary knelt, brushing snow from his face. A scar cut through his cheek, pale against skin weathered by years of sun. His eyes fluttered open, storm gray, piercing, then gone again into unconsciousness. Samuel's voice quavered. "He's a cowboy, ain't he?" Mary didn't answer. Cowboys meant guns, cards, and trouble. Men who wandered from ranch to ranch, leaving nothing behind but debts or blood. But this one was dying in their arms, and that changed everything. She fetched what little they had, a blanket, a stub of candle, the last of Mama's firewood. The flames struggled, barely pushing back the shadows. The man groaned once, a sound torn from deep in his chest, and Mary felt a shiver that wasn't from the cold. For the first time since Papa died last spring, their barn held the presence of a man. And not just any man. One who carried the weight of storms on his shoulders. Outside, the snow buried their tracks, erasing the moment from the world as if it had never happened. But Mary knew something had shifted. She stared at the stranger, his gun belt loose around his hips, boots scuffed from long roads. Who was he? A drifter? A wanted man? Or something else? All she knew was this. When the storm ended, nothing in their lives would ever be the same. The blizzard raged for 2 days. Snow pressed heavy against the walls, and the little barn became both prison and refuge. The children tended to the stranger as best they could, Samuel keeping the candle alive, Mary feeding him sips of melted snow mixed with a scrap of dried apple. On the third morning, he stirred. His eyes opened slowly, catching the flicker of firelight. He tried to rise, but the movement brought a grimace, and his hand went instinctively to his ribs. Mary froze, clutching Samuel's arm. The cowboy's gaze settled on them, sharp, wary, like a wounded wolf cornered by children. His voice rasped, low and broken. "Where am I?" Mary swallowed. "Our barn." He blinked, taking in the half-broken rafters above, the dirt floor beneath. His hand twitched toward his side, not for his wound, but for the revolver that lay on the ground where Samuel had kicked it away. Mary's chin lifted, though her hands trembled. "We don't mean you harm. Storm would have killed you." The cowboy's eyes softened just for a heartbeat, then hardened again. "Storm kills everyone, sooner or later." Samuel whispered, "Are you an outlaw?" The boy's words hung in the cold air like a challenge, innocent and bold. The man didn't answer. He let his head fall back against the wall, exhaling through clenched teeth. Silence filled the barn again. Not empty silence, but a thick, weighted kind. Distrust, suspicion, and something else Mary couldn't name. By afternoon he could sit upright. Mary gave him bread crusts, watching the way he ate, slow, controlled, every movement like a man used to hunger. She noticed details, the scar on his cheek, the lines at his eyes, the way his coat was patched in 3 different shades of leather. When he finally spoke again, it was quiet. "You saved me." Mary shook her head. "We only dragged you out of the snow. God will decide the rest." His lips pressed into the shadow of a smile, the first flicker of something human. "Name's Elias." Mary hesitated, then offered, "Mary, this is Samuel." The cowboy's eyes lingered on the boy, then on her. There was no warmth, not yet, but there was recognition of loneliness mirrored back at him. That night the wind eased, leaving a silence almost heavier than the storm. Elias sat by the fire, shoulders hunched, hat brim shading his eyes. Samuel dozed against Mary's side, and the flames cast their shadows tall against the splintered beams. Mary dared to speak. "Will you ride on when you're able?" Elias didn't look at her. His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I don't stay long in places." The words fell like stones, but beneath them, Mary heard something else. A man running not from the law, but from himself. She said nothing more. The barn was filled with silence again. The silence of strangers, tied together by chance, distrust, and a storm that had forced them under the same broken roof. But something unspoken lingered. Something neither of them would admit yet. Fate had already chosen the path ahead. The storm passed, but winter's grip did not. Snow still buried the prairie, a white sea stretching endless beyond the barn. The cabin, half collapsed from autumn's windstorm, was too dangerous to sleep in. So the children and Elias remained in the barn, huddled near the fire pit Mary had dug into the dirt. Elias grew stronger each day. His ribs were tender, his cough sharp in the mornings, but his hands were steady, steady enough to split wood, steady enough to mend. On the 4th morning, Mary found him outside in the pale sun, hammering new nails into the broken doorframe. "You shouldn't," she said, her voice edged with both warning and wonder. He didn't look at her, just drove another nail home with calm precision. "Storm's gone. Wolves ain't. You'll need this door tight." Mary crossed her arms. She wanted to tell him he was a stranger, that he owed them nothing. But when Samuel ran past, chasing a half-frozen chicken through the snow, Elias's gaze followed the boy. And for a flicker of a moment, his face changed. Not softer, but haunted. A man remembering something lost. That evening, Elias taught Samuel how to whittle kindling shavings fine enough to catch spark. The boy's laughter, rare as spring rain, echoed in the rafters. Mary watched silently as Elias corrected Samuel's grip with patient hands. The sight of them, boy and drifter, side by side, stirred something in her chest she hadn't felt since Papa was alive. The next day, Elias brought in a broken doll from where it had lain forgotten in the snow. Its porcelain face cracked, hair matted. Without a word, he sat by the fire and worked. Hours later, he handed it back to Mary, the hair brushed, the arm stitched with leather thread. Mary held the doll close. She wanted to thank him, but found her throat too tight with feeling. Instead, she set a bowl of stew by his side. Their eyes met only briefly, yet it was more than words. Days passed into weeks. Together, they worked on the cabin, log by log, beam by beam. Elias showed Samuel how to set a notch, how to balance the weight. Mary carried stones for the hearth, her breath misting in the cold. Every sound, the thud of axes, the scrape of saws, became the heartbeat of something new rising from ruin. At night, they ate by firelight. Conversation was scarce, but the silence was no longer suspicion. It was company. Elias would sometimes glance at Mary across the flames, his eyes shadowed, his hand resting near the gun he never wore anymore. She wondered about the life behind that scar, about the grief that seemed to cling to him like a second coat. One evening, after Samuel had fallen asleep, with the mended doll in his arms, Elias whispered so low, Mary almost didn't hear. "Home's a heavy word." She turned to him, the fire, painting his face in gold and shadow. Her voice was steady, but it's the only word that matters. For the first time, Elias didn't look away, and in that silence, heavier than any storm, something began, fragile, uncertain, but alive. Spring crept in slowly, dripping from the eaves and loosening the grip of frost. The cabin walls stood taller now, their corners locked tight, a home rising where ruin once was. For the first time in months, Mary caught herself humming while she worked. Samuel carried wood with a pride he'd never known. Elias, though still restless, had begun to linger in small ways, patching harness straps, smoothing the cabin's beams with care that betrayed a man not quite ready to leave. But the town noticed. It started with whispers at Sunday service. Mary had taken Samuel, leaving Elias behind to finish roofing, but she felt the weight of eyes on her back. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Calloway, spoke too loudly as the congregation filed out. "A widow, alone with a drifter. No wonder her cabin rises so fast." The words cut sharper than the prairie wind. Mary lowered her gaze, clenching Samuel's hand, but the gossip followed her like burrs. By the next week, it had reached the council. Some muttered about decency, others about land rights. A widow's claim was fragile, easy prey for men who wanted her acres for grazing. Elias's presence gave them reason to prod. That evening, as she returned home, Elias saw the storm behind her eyes. He asked nothing at first, but when she set the stew pot too hard upon the hearth, he spoke quietly. "What did they say?" Mary's throat tightened. "They think I've given you more than shelter." Elias's jaw worked, the scar on his cheek pale against firelight. "And have you?" Her cheeks flushed. "I've given you work, food, that's all." Silence stretched, thick with unspoken truths neither dared admit. Finally, Elias stood, his hand brushing the brim of his hat. "Maybe I should ride on, before they bring you harm." The words struck her like a whip. "You'd leave Samuel without a man's teaching? Leave me to finish what we started?" Her voice cracked, trembling between anger and fear. "Is that all storms mean to you? A place to hide until the sky clears?" For a long moment, Elias said nothing. His eyes were dark, burdened by ghosts Mary could not see. When he finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "Storms take everything from me. Every time I try to stay, I bury more than I build." Samuel, woken by their raised voices, stumbled from his pallet. "You ain't leavin', are you?" His small face, pale with worry, broke whatever armor Elias still wore. He crouched, placing a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder, but he didn't answer. The next days grew heavy with tension. Mary worked in silence, her hands raw from hauling stone. Elias threw himself into the cabin frame, swinging the axe until sweat froze on his brow. At Ibi, night. The air between them burned colder than the winds outside. Then came the riders. 3 men, ranchers' hands by the look of their dusters and guns. They rode hard into the yard at dusk, their leader's voice sharp. "Widow's land don't last without a man's name to hold it. Council'll hear our claim next week, unless you care to make other arrangements." Mary stood tall, though her heart thudded. Elias stepped out from the shadows of the half-built cabin, revolver resting easy in his grip. His voice was low, steady as stone. "She's got a man's name here already. Mine." The riders sneered, but beneath their mockery was unease. The cabin, the family, the firelight, it was no longer just a widow's struggle. Elias had drawn a line, and now there would be blood before it was crossed. The riders returned at dawn 3 days later. Their hoofbeats thundered across the frozen ground, echoing off the timbered hills like war drums. The town council had given them courage. The gossip hardened into challenge. They came not to threaten now, but to claim. Mary stood in the doorway of the half-built cabin, Samuel clutching her skirts. Behind them, the hearth was cold, the walls unfinished. Elias walked out slowly, revolver loose at his side, hat brim shadowing his scarred face. The lead rider, a broad man with a rust-red beard, spat into the snow. "Time's up, widow. This land's too much for a woman. We'll see it signed over before sundown." Mary's voice was steady, though her hands trembled. "My husband's buried here. My children are raised here. This land is ours." The rider's eyes flicked to Elias. "Not unless the drifter's got a claim, and he don't." Elias's silence stretched long. Every muscle in him seemed carved from stone, yet his jaw worked, as if chewing through years of grief and hesitation. His voice, when it came, was low, deliberate. "I've buried enough. I ain't burying them too." He stepped forward, placing himself between Mary and the riders. His revolver lifted, steady as the rising sun. The rancher's men drew iron. For a heartbeat, the world hung in stillness, snow drifting, breath fogging, Samuel's small cry caught in the air. Then gunfire split the dawn. The first shot rang from Elias's Colt, dropping one rider from his saddle. The second thundered back, grazing Elias's shoulder, spinning him half around. Mary screamed, dragging Samuel inside, but Elias planted his boots, teeth bared, and fired again. The yard erupted, horses rearing, men shouting, gunpowder stinging the air. Elias moved with a kind of grim grace, every shot measured, every step pushing the riders back from the cabin. His wound bled, dark against his coat, but he didn't falter. Not this time. Not for them. The rust-bearded leader dismounted, charging forward with pistol raised. Elias met him halfway, the 2 men crashing into the snow, fists and steel colliding. The fight was brutal, raw, the sound of flesh against flesh, echoing through the still morning. Finally, Elias wrenched the pistol free and leveled it, chest heaving. "Ride!" he growled, voice ragged. "Ride, and don't set foot here again." The remaining men didn't wait to test him. They dragged their wounded and galloped into the horizon, leaving silence heavy in their wake. Elias staggered, blood staining his sleeve, revolver slipping from his hand into the snow. Mary rushed to him, catching his weight before he fell. Their eyes locked, his storm gray, her fire bright, and in that moment, words were no longer needed. "You stayed," she whispered, voice breaking. His hand trembled as it rose to her cheek, the calloused touch softer than anything she had known in months of hardship. "Storm's done," he said, and this time his voice held no grief, only resolve. The prairie was silent again, save for the crackle of a new fire Samuel had lit inside. Smoke rose from the chimney, a fragile banner of survival, of defiance, of something more. For the first time, Elias had chosen not to run. He had chosen to stand, not just against bullets, but against the weight of his own ghosts. Weeks passed. The snow melted into rivulets that cut through the prairie, feeding the first green shoots of spring. The cabin stood tall now, roof sealed against rain, stone hearth warm with steady fire. Where ruin had once loomed, a home rose, shaped by calloused hands, children's laughter, and the silence of a man who no longer wandered. Elias healed slowly. The bullet scar tugged at his shoulder when he lifted the axe, but Mary noticed he never complained. Samuel shadowed him constantly, eager to carry nails, to fetch water, to learn the way. Elias cut a log true in one strike. The boy's eyes, once dimmed by winter, shone with the hunger of a son watching a father, though the word had not yet been spoken. One morning, Mary stepped outside to find Elias crouched by the bare patch of earth near the cabin. He pressed a sapling into the soil, a thin apple tree, roots wrapped in burlap. Her breath caught. "Where did you?" He shrugged, but there was a softness in his tone. "Traded for it in town. Figured this land needed something that grows." Mary knelt beside him, her fingers brushing soil over the fragile roots. Together they pressed the earth firm. For a moment their hands touched, rough skin against rough skin, and neither pulled away. That night, Mary set stew on the table of their new cabin. Samuel bowed his head in clumsy prayer, giving thanks for the roof, the food, and for Elias who keeps the wolves away. When he lifted his face again, he added shyly, "Thank you, Papa." The word hung in the firelit air. Elias froze, eyes dark as storm clouds. But this time there was no escape in them. Only the weight of something he had long thought lost. Slowly, he reached across the table, his rough hand covering Samuel's small one. His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "Ain't had a name like that in a long while. But I'll carry it." Mary's eyes filled, though she hid her tears behind a quiet smile. For the first time since her husband's death, the cabin didn't feel half empty. It felt whole. The weeks turned into months. The town still whispered, some with scorn, some with approval. But the gossip no longer mattered. Smoke rose each evening from the chimney, a steady mark against the sky, saying to all who passed, "This place is held, and it is home." By summer, the apple tree blossomed, pale flowers trembling in the warm wind. Mary stood on the porch, Samuel chasing chickens in the yard, and Elias splitting wood by the fence. She closed her eyes, listening not to storm winds, not to the silence of loneliness, but to the steady rhythm of a chosen life. Elias leaned his axe against the post and walked to her side. He didn't speak. Words were scarce, always would be. But his arm brushed hers, firm and sure. She tilted her head toward him, and together they watched the blossoms drift like snow across their land. A widow's grief, a drifter's exile, a storm that nearly swallowed them whole. All of it had led here, to this fragile miracle of family. The prairie stretched wide and wild, but for the first time, Mary did not feel small against it. She felt rooted, like the sapling they had planted. And Elias, once a man who had buried everything he loved, now stood where the earth was rich, the sky vast, and a boy's voice called him Papa. The storm was behind them. The future had begun. If stories like this move your heart, and you'd like to walk further down the dusty trails of the Old West with us, don't forget to subscribe. Every tale carries a secret worth hearing, and the next one might be the one you'll never forget.